Now, getting into our first segment of the day with South Carolina winning the national championship in the women's tournament. The Gamecocks finished their year 38-0, a perfect season for them. They pick up a win against Iowa in the national championship game, 87-75. They become the fifth program in women's history to ever be an undefeated national champion. By the way, UConn did that 6 times. Absolutely ridiculous from that program, of course, which will sort of take me into some of the legacy conversations as the show goes on here. But Dawn Staley, who has basically 2 Hall of Fame careers, one as a player and one as a coach, has led South Carolina to their 3rd national championship and really has just built South Carolina from the ground up and has really made a name for herself. As much love and respect as Caitlin Clark deservingly gets, Dawn Staley does deserve a lot of credit as well. I feel like I sort of see a little bit of a Dan Hurley comparison because as I'm watching this game, I'm just looking at how she's reacting to all of the calls, non-calls. She's going berserk. At first, I'm getting a little bit annoyed, but then I thought to myself how hypocritical I was being because on the other end, I actually really enjoy watching Dan Hurley and UConn and all of his antics. So again, just sort of buying into sometimes you got to have a little bit of that edge to be a great one in sports, and Staley has absolutely shown that she is one of the greats. But as for this game itself, Iowa was actually the one who got out to the hot start in this case. They were up 10-0 within the first couple minutes here, and Caitlin Clark really started getting herself going, scoring 13 straight points for Iowa. That included a near logo 3-pointer, and the fact that she showed that type of range early, you know, you could see South Carolina almost panicking on how to guard her, where they were pressing up on her. They ended up fouling her on multiple 3-point attempts, including one that was minimum 27 feet away from the basket. Was pretty ridiculous. And I felt like at this point, you could sort of feel the nation kind of turning this game into a statement about the referees. But I did think that the foul calls at least were fair. And Clark ended up scoring 18 points in that first quarter, the most ever in a single quarter of a championship game in the women's tournament. And if Iowa had any chance to win this game, they were going to need Caitlin Clark to continue on that type of a pace, and she was just unable to do so. The size and the depth of South Carolina just started becoming more and more of an issue for Iowa as the game went on. They ended up out-rebounding the Hawkeyes 51-29. Nobody on Iowa had the size to properly match up against Kamilla Cardoso, who had 7 offensive rebounds, 17 total. And early in that game, Cardoso actually felt like she was leaving a lot of buckets out on the court. Her finishing wasn't even tremendous in this game. Now, she scored 15 points with 7 of 14 from the field. So she was a force. She was very important in this game, but she didn't attempt a shot from outside the restricted area. She was up in close the entire time, and it felt like there were a couple opportunities there where, especially as South Carolina is trailing early, it felt like it could potentially be a backbreaker if this ended up being a close game down the stretch. But ultimately, Iowa wasn't able to keep up pace. And again, not trying to take away from Cardoso whatsoever, but that was something that stood out to me as the game was playing out. But the reason why this didn't end up being a backbreaker is the fact that South Carolina's bench was tremendous in this game and was just so much more impactful than that of Iowa, where the Gamecocks got 37 points off of their bench to Iowa's 0. Pretty much impossible to win a game when you have a discrepancy like that, along to go with the rebounding discrepancy as well. But South Carolina got some key contributions as well from some of their freshman talent, specifically Tessa Johnson led the entire team in scoring with 19 points. She went 7 of 11 from the field, 3 of 6 from 3. Was a very encouraging performance there, as South Carolina is going to obviously look to continue their winning streak into next season as well. Cardoso is going to be in the WNBA draft this upcoming April as well. So really just showed South Carolina how dominant of a program they were this season. They were clearly the better team than Iowa, and Iowa did try and make it close down the stretch of the fourth quarter. South Carolina led by as much as 14, and Iowa ended up bringing the deficit down to 5 points with a few minutes left in that fourth quarter. And as that game was sort of tightening up, I was paying a little bit of extra attention to the officiating, because after the semifinals game where Iowa played UConn, there was a lot of controversy. Of course, if you didn't see that one, UConn trailed by 1 point with 10 seconds left is when they called their timeout, and Aaliyah Edwards ended up getting called for a moving screen with 4 seconds left in the game, which pretty much sealed it for Iowa. Now, there was a ton of outrage and backlash because of this, and not that I want to fully dive into that whole situation here, because ultimately wherever you sort of land on the discussion about how involved officiating should be at the end of games, ultimately nobody's going to convince anyone else that they are right necessarily. It's just two sides yelling at one another. But as far as where I stand on this, the screen from Edwards was clearly illegal. She was sliding her feet the whole time. At one point, she was, doing the splits basically, and then followed whatever Marshall, I believe her name was, following her out to the 3-point line. It was a moving screen. Now, you can have a very fair argument if you dislike the timing of when they called it. I'm not going to push back a ton in that sense, but the counter argument is if it's a foul in the first 5 seconds of the game, it's a foul in the last 5 seconds of the game. And this specific example might not be quite as egregious, but when you do look on the other side of the coin a little bit, and this is a little bit of an abstract comparison, but if you look at the NFC Championship game from the 2018 season between the Saints and the Rams, we had one of the biggest no calls in the history of professional sports, really, because of the fact that Nickel Roby Coleman absolutely laid out the Saints player. It was Tommy Lee something at the time. Tommy Lee Lewis, I think, and it caused the NFL to implement one of the dumbest rule changes in the history of the league, basically, when they were doing the challenging pass interferences. A no call is still a call in some sense, and again, I feel like people were especially so up in arms about this because of the fact that it had Iowa winning. The NCAA clearly would have benefited more from Caitlin Clark and Iowa advancing than UConn. Everybody wants to say it's rigged and how unfair life is. Ultimately, again, I thought it was the right call, and I probably already spent too much time on this. But because of all of that and the drama that followed, or preceded, I should say, I was hyper aware of the officiating in this game and was making notes of calls that I didn't love. That included a shooting foul that was called against South Carolina with 4:13 left in the game to put Sydney Afalter at the free throw line, who knocked it down to make it that 5-point game with just a few minutes left. But after that, pretty much all the whistles went against Iowa, and I was honestly relieved, as much as I was sort of rooting for Iowa to win this game just because of some of the other toxic discourse that was taking place surrounding Caitlin Clark and her legacy and everything. I wanted her to win the championship just to be able to sort of shut up that side of the party. But honestly, way better than having the refs get involved in another win for Iowa and the Hawkeyes. And I wouldn't say this game ultimately turned out to be any kind of an all-timer necessarily, but it was still great for the sport having this all-time team face off against probably the biggest star in the history of women's college basketball. We're still waiting on the viewership numbers to come out about this game in particular, but if you look at the previous two games with Iowa, they had 12.3 million viewers when they played LSU. That broke the record for the most viewed college women's basketball game in history. And then they broke that record with their next game against UConn, pulling in 14.2. Game even peaked at 17 million in that game. And those are numbers according to Nielsen and the Washington Post. And according to the Washington Post, that UConn game broke the record for the most viewed ESPN basketball broadcast ever, which was previously, I think it was the 2018 Eastern Conference Finals during Game 7. But, again, all of these numbers can be a little bit, I don't know. I don't want to say fishy necessarily, but at the same time, numbers are what they are, and we just sort of, as consumers, have to take them for what they say. And I thought that, again, it was really encouraging to see the sport of women's college basketball take over the country the way it was. And like I sort of alluded to as well, the fact that you have, as much as it's ugly necessary sort of with the conversations, it can get very toxic, the whole GOAT debate and arguing over refs. Again, I can find her name right now, but the woman, it was Gabby Marshall, the woman who was fouled on the Aaliyah Edwards play, moving screen in the semifinal game. She came out and said that she had to delete her social media because of the amount of hate comments she was getting. And as much as you're a loser if you are posting hate comments to somebody for playing a professional sport, that's obvious, but in a really demented way almost, it does show that the game is at least getting to a big enough point where it is receiving this type of national attention. And there are absolutely things that we as a, sports fandom community have to get better at. But at least, women's college basketball is starting to arrive in that sense now. If we can just sort of figure out the other issues that are inherently wrong with the sports fandom as a whole, then we can move into a better place. So we're going to be continuing on the conversation here about the women's game. We do have a comment from Kirito. He first said, "Tired of fans not showing class. I am sick of it. Maybe I am the wired one. Am I the wired one?" Not totally sure what you mean by that. If you want to sort of elaborate, I can try and answer that more likely. And then an additional comment saying, "I got the feeling Colin Sexton will not be on the Jazz next year." It's interesting because as somebody who's a Celtics fan, Danny Ainge used to be the general manager of the Celtics. Now he's with the Jazz, and sort of similar to what we saw earlier during the trade deadline, Danny Ainge doesn't necessarily make trades and deals that 100% line up with what a prototypical rebuild or such is. When you look back at the Celtics, they ended up making the trade for Isaiah Thomas just because it was an asset that's value was on the lower end. So he bought low, and that ultimately ended up jump-starting this Celtics rebuild. And as far as the Jazz, I think that anything is on the table in terms of what Danny Ainge is going to do, in terms of what types of trades he's going to make. I like Colin Sexton a lot. I know that, at times he can be, I don't even think erratic is the right word necessarily, but, he's not the number one most stable necessarily point guard in the league. He's probably more of a 2 in a perfect world ultimately, but I think he's also still a very good player. I'm curious what type of value he could get out on the open market, but we'll see. Let me know where specifically you think Sexton could end up, if not the Jazz next year. But we are going to be taking our first break of the show, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to be diving into, as much as I just sort of made fun of the conversations surrounding legacy and GOAT talk and everything along those lines, we are going to be reflecting on Caitlin Clark's college career and what sort of legacy she is leaving behind. So stick with us, and we will be right back.